Lecture number 1, The Purge of God. In this lecture, we're going to talk about the different themes in Isaiah. One important theme is about purging. That is about taking impurities out of metal. But of course, now here in Isaiah we talk about the purging from sin. We will see where the division breaks ought to be in the horizontal, and whether Isaiah is one book or a collection of writings from different authors. We will share a little bit more on who Isaiah was. We will cover some historical backgrounds, important dates including when this book might have been written. Now that you have done your first reading and you have jotted down some of your first impressions about what themes there are in the book, I would like you to compare what you have found with what is listed on the PowerPoint. These are only some of the themes, and the more often you read Isaiah, the more themes you probably will find in them. Idolatry especially is highlighted in chapter 40 to 48. Trust is a very important theme in this book. Both Ahaz and Hezekiah were confronted with a crisis and told to trust God. There is this idea of purging. Isaiah surprises his audience about Gentile inclusion. He talks about the servant, talks about redemption. Even before you began the field-based SBS, you probably already knew that Isaiah had messianic prophecies. Indeed, in Isaiah we read about the Messiah. We see worship songs throughout Isaiah. Isaiah talks about Zion and the remnant. What is the most common structure used in the prophets? The answer is judgment to restoration. So where will the division break be for this book? The answer is chapter 40, verse 1. Chapter 1 to 39 is predominantly about judgment. Chapter 40 to 66 is predominantly about restoration. This break is so clear that many modern scholars believe the second half is an entire different book written by a different author. I say quote-unquote modern scholars because up till just over 100 years ago, nobody suggested that the book of Isaiah must have had multiple authors. Only modern scholars can come up with these new ideas, I guess because they have nothing else to do. This subject is described as the unity of Isaiah, and if you were to Google this, you will find plenty of material on the subject. 100 years ago, scholars suddenly began to argue that this second division could not have been written by the same author. The reason they gave are the historical setting fits a different time period. The assumption throughout the text in the second half of the book is that the people are already in Babylon, and the predictions are about the release from Babylon. There are prophecy of restoration and the actual mentioning of Cyrus by name. Isaiah could not have known this 200 years in advance. Isaiah's name has been mentioned in the first division but never in the second. Now these considerations brought forth their objections. They say we don't know who wrote it, but somehow two pieces of work from different sources were combined. The author of the Book of Comfort is nicknamed Second Isaiah. Once liberals start with this, there is no end to this. They invented a third Isaiah as well, and even more. Perhaps the most common view is that Isaiah wrote chapter 1 to 39, that a second Isaiah wrote chapter 40 to 56, and a third Isaiah wrote chapter 57 to 66. But I don't agree with this liberal view. I believe Isaiah is the author simply because it says so in chapter 1 verse 1. There is a strong tradition among both Christian and Jewish scholarship that Isaiah wrote all of Isaiah even though they were all very much aware that the second half of the book is remarkably different. Its authorship was never questioned in the past. Many among the liberal scholarship don't believe in the miraculous. In fact, they don't believe in God. Of course, they then have difficulty believing the supernatural in this book. And this is the main reason authorship has suddenly become an issue. It is true that Isaiah didn't live when Babylon became a threat, and the original audience must have been wondering, who is Babylon? It's the Assyrians that I'm worried about. Still, many short-term prophecies were fulfilled in the lifetime of Isaiah's audience. But then there were also long-term prophecies, only fulfilled some 150 years later, when Isaiah is prophesying about Babylon. I believe God can predict, and I believe this is a miraculous book. And Isaiah is talking about Jesus too, 700 years later before it happened. I believe that too. If you stop believing in the prophecies in Isaiah, you may as well stop believing in Christianity altogether. On the other hand, if we believe the prophecies we read about in Isaiah are supernatural, and we can see how they are fulfilled, does that not strengthen our Christian faith? And it gives me every reason to believe that the prophecy is still outstanding, such as about the new heaven and new earth, will come to fulfillment as well. But there is also internal evidence. Though the second half of the book is remarkably different, the shift from chapter 1 to 39 to chapter 40 to 66 is very natural and common in all the prophetic books, that is, going from judgment to restoration. The vocabulary used in the book supports the one authorship argument. 25 words unique to Isaiah only and used throughout the book. No other known Old Testament author uses those words. Key expressions such as "for the name of God," the Holy One of Israel, is a term used for God 12 times in chapter 1 to 39 and 14 times in chapter 40 to 66, and outside of Isaiah only found 6 times. That makes it a distinctly Isaiah term. Many themes are repeated throughout the book and in both divisions of the book. Just to give you a few of the many references. Judgment like a fire that is unquenchable, 1:31, 66:24. Picture of Gentiles streaming to a mountain of the Lord, chapter 2 verse 2, 56 verse 7, 66:20. What do they travel on? A highway. God constructing a highway to Zion, 11 verse 16, 40 verses 3 to 5. Depicting a new heaven and a new earth with a lamb and a wolf living together as are on both sides, 11 verses 6 to 9, 65 verse 25. The setting up of a signal, which is like a banner or a flag, for nations to rally around, chapter 11 verse 12, 49 verse 22. God's abhorrence of mere formal worship, chapter 1 verse 11 and 13 and 66:3. God dwelling in a high and lofty place, 6:1, 57:15. Spirit of the Lord resting on the Messiah, chapter 11 verse 2, 61 verses 1. Then we can see that the New Testament too supports Isaiah authorship of the whole of Isaiah. The New Testament quotes from the book of Isaiah many times, but 20 times specifically mentioning his name. And these quotes are from both the first half and the second half of Isaiah, so the New Testament attributes the whole of Isaiah to one and the same man. Matthew quotes Isaiah 6 times by name, 3 times from the first division and 3 times from the second. In John 12, verses 38 to 40, in just one passage, we read 2 quotes from Isaiah, one from the first, found in Isaiah 6, and one from the second division, found in Isaiah 53. On each occasion John says, Isaiah says this. On the handout, Isaiah in the New Testament, you see the New Testament references that support Isaiah authorship. It's clear from the evidence of Scripture that Jesus, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and Paul considered the prophet Isaiah as the author of the entire book. Then the last but not least argument I have is the following. After the liberals began inventing all these new theories, the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered. The big question was whether it would shed new light on this question. What they found was Isaiah on 2 scrolls. So if Isaiah chapter 40 verse 1 would have started on a new scroll, the liberals would have proven to be right. But the second scroll starts with chapter 40 verse 2. Would it not have been more natural for the scribes, if they believed chapter 39 was the end of one book, to have left it at that and begin a new book on a new scroll? Of course it would have, except those scribes knew it was one book, so they kept writing. Isaiah was a prophet. He had more to say about Messiah than any other prophet, and so it's often called the prophet of the Messiah. He is also called the evangelist of the Old Testament. There is only one other book that may even have more to say about Jesus Christ, judging by the number of times Psalms is quoted in the New Testament. But Psalms is not a prophetic book, and that makes Isaiah the most quoted prophetic book by the New Testament writers. Isaiah was a historian. Isaiah wrote also some historical accounts. We have here chapter 7 and 8, chapter 36 to 39. In addition, Isaiah wrote books of history that are now lost. He wrote a biography on the life of King Uzziah, according to 2 Chronicles 26:22. He wrote a book of the kings of Judah and Israel, according to 2 Chronicles 32:32. Isaiah was a poet. The book of Isaiah contains some of the best poetry that can be found in our Bible. Hebrew scholars say this material is one of the most beautiful and profound poetry in existence, equivalent to Shakespeare in the English literature. Isaiah was a statesman. Isaiah was believed to have been born in Jerusalem and was related to the royal house of Judah. Tradition says he was a chief citizen of Jerusalem, a noble man. So he was unlike some of the other prophets who would suddenly show up out of the wilderness eating grasshoppers. He had access to the throne and gave counsel to the kings, as we read he counseled both Ahaz and Hezekiah in this book. Isaiah's time period corresponds with chapter 15 to 20 in 2 Kings and chapter 26 to 32 in 2 Chronicles. Prophets contemporary with Isaiah were Micah, who ministered to the south, sometimes called the Little Isaiah, Amos and Hosea, who prophesied in the north, and Jonah, who, we all know, ended up going to Nineveh in Assyria. Just prior to the time of Isaiah was called into ministry, the nation had enjoyed peace with his neighboring nations. There was no threat from Syria, the armies of Assyria were still far away, and there was no civil war between the north and the south. Like the north that had prospered under the long reign of Jeroboam II, as seen in books such as Amos, the prophet of social justice, Judah too experienced economic prosperity and military expansion under the reign of Uzziah. Arab, European and Egyptian traders, if traveling over land, had to go through Israel and Judah, so these two nations prospered economically by levying tax from these traders. However, this prosperity was beneficial only to the wealthy. The poor were exploited and neglected. King Tiglath-Pileser III, or King Pul in our Bible, began an expansion conquest around 745 BC, right about the same time Isaiah began his ministry. In Isaiah we read that God used Assyria as a rod of his anger to judge his people. Samaria falls to the Assyrians in 722 BC, and those who were not killed were deported, never to hear of again. Judah also suffered greatly under the hand of the Assyrians.
While Assyria was the ruling empire, Babylon was under its rule. In 626 BC, Nabopolassar cleared the Assyrians out of Babylon, which began to weaken the Assyrian Empire. Nebuchadnezzar began his reign in 605 BC after the Battle of Carchemish, where he defeated Necho, king of Egypt. King Josiah got himself killed just prior to that battle between those two nations. You can see that in 2 Kings chapter 23, verses 29. The Jews in Judah suffered 3 major deportations in 605 BC, in 597 BC, and finally in 586 BC, when Jerusalem was completely destroyed. For more information on Assyria and Babylon, please refer to the handout Isaiah's Nations. The kings during Isaiah's time are listed in chapter 1, verse 1. Young Isaiah received a vision of God and was called into ministry in chapter 6. This happened in the year King Uzziah died. Jotham was his son who succeeded his throne. After that we read quite a bit about King Ahaz and King Hezekiah. In order to have survived so many kings, Isaiah must have gotten pretty old. Tradition has it that Isaiah died a martyr's death, under the reign of Manasseh, but the king's name is not mentioned.
Important dates you must know for this book are 732 BC. This is when the first siege of Jerusalem happened by Syria and Israel, who made an alliance. Assyria comes to Judah's rescue, and consequently Damascus falls to the Assyrians. In 722 BC, Samaria falls to Assyria. In 701 BC, there is another siege of Jerusalem, this time by the Assyrians. Important dates when prophecies from Isaiah come to fulfillment are, of course, 586 BC and 539 BC. 586 BC is when Jerusalem fell to the Babylonians and most survivors are deported. 539 BC is when the Persians defeated the Babylonians and the first Persian emperor, Cyrus, made a decree that allowed all those who were deported by the Babylonians to return to their homeland. As a result, some of the Jews returned to Jerusalem, and we read about that in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. Now this book appears to be somewhat in chronological order. The next slide is on the chronology of Isaiah. On the first line of this PowerPoint you see the names of the kings and when they ruled. The dates we can find back in the book of Isaiah appear to be in chronological order, and you can see them on the PowerPoint in black and bold letters. We can link these dates with the narrators, noted N, and are in the red color, as well as the prophecies, noted P, and are in blue. The dates between brackets are prophecies left undated, but if you assume that those two are in chronological order, we can roughly guess when these prophecies were given. If Isaiah only began his ministry in chapter 6, what do we do with chapter 1 to 5? Some suggest Isaiah was already ministering to the Lord and got another confirmation of the call in chapter 6. In that case, those prophecies in chapter 1 to 5 were made in the reign of King Uzziah. Others suggest chapter 1 through 6 is an introduction to the book, contrasting the sinfulness of the people in chapter 1 to 5 with the holiness of God revealed in chapter 6. Certainly, when you read about the conditions the people were in, we see the dire need Judah was in for a prophet, and understanding the severity of God's call on Isaiah in chapter 6. Chapter 7 to 8 is about a siege of Jerusalem that happened in 732 BC. Aram, which is Syria, and Israel attacked Jerusalem, and King Ahaz of Judah paid money to the king of Assyria to come to his rescue, resulting in the overthrow of Damascus, which happened in 732 BC. Isaiah received his call prior to that in chapter 6, when King Uzziah died, according to 6:1, and we know that happened in 740 BC. Beginning with 14 verse 28, the prophecies given started in the year that the reign of King Ahaz ended. That was in 715 BC. continuing to assume chronological order, the not yet dated portion 9:1 to 14:27 must then have happened after 732 BC, but before Ahaz died in 715. Chapter 20 mentions the fall of Ashdod. That happened in 711 BC. It was during that time that Isaiah walked around naked prophesying to Egypt for 3 years. What date can we give to chapter 21 to 35? If the text is mostly in chronological order, these prophecies can be dated between 709 and 701 BC. Why? Because chapter 36 to 39 is again about a siege which happened in 701 BC. This time Jerusalem was besieged by the Assyrians. King Sennacherib comes against Judah in the 14th year of Hezekiah's reign, according to 36 verse 1. Assyria had pretty much destroyed all the fortified cities of Judah, including Lachish, 37 verse 8, and took 200,000 captive but was not able to overthrow Jerusalem. Hezekiah died almost childless. On his deathbed he asked for an extension on his life, and God gave him another 15 years. 3 years into that, Manasseh was born. Thus Manasseh became king at age 12. He turned out to be the worst king Judah has ever had, though in Chronicles we read about his repentance later in life. What is left now is chapter 40 to 66. The dates must be between 701 and 681 BC, but if all of it is given under the reign of Hezekiah, not under the reign of Manasseh, since he is not listed in 1:1, then the prophecies were given between 701 and 687 BC. Now, I believe no new prophecies were written after Hezekiah, since Manasseh is not listed in 1:1, though Isaiah did continue his ministry a couple more years into the reign of Manasseh. We know this because the final edition of the book was completed only in 681 BC, or after 681 BC, the year that Sennacherib died, and is recorded in 3738. Thus the number of the years in ministry is from 740 BC to 681 BC, which is 59 years. Now, if Isaiah began ministering around at age 30, he would have reached the age of 89. So he got pretty old. Tradition says that Manasseh had Isaiah sawed into two while he was hiding in a hollow trunk of a tree. There must be some truth to this tradition, as the Hebrew author does mention in Hebrews 11:37 that some of the heroes of faith were sawn into two, and we do not know anybody else that this might have referred to. As part of your assignment, I've asked you to read the historical narratives in Isaiah in chapter 7 to 8 and chapter 36 to 39. The siege of Jerusalem is featured in both. First, we read about a siege done by an alliance between Aram and Israel coming against Jerusalem in 732 BC when Ahaz was king. Then we read about another siege done by Assyria when Hezekiah was king, and that happened around 701 BC. Looking at the details in this book, we see this constant interchange between judgment and salvation in both the first and second division. They are like cycles. The question to ask is, why does Isaiah do that? The answer to that is that God doesn't desire one's condemnation, but redemption. God at the end doesn't want judgment, but salvation. Things are not supposed to end with judgment. Judging is supposed to be a means to reach a different end, deliverance. Judgment is God's disciplinary action on his people. He wants to deal with the nation's sin. So the judgment to restoration process is a cycle we see repeated throughout the book. It is to purge from sin. For example, the nation Judah would no longer worship idols after 586 BC. The nation was truly purged from the sin of idolatry. We also see judgment coming upon pagan nations. A lot of text is devoted to that. But then sometimes we also read briefly about that nation's restoration. For example, the smaller nations such as Philistia is judged in 1421-31, but then restored in 1432. Moab is condemned in chapter 15 and experienced salvation after that in the first few verses of chapter 16. Bigger nations such as Egypt and Assyria are extensively condemned on many occasions, but they are restored too. They too are cleansed. Only Babylon will not have that pleasure, but that doesn't mean God has no restoration in mind for them, because really, the prediction of restoration that is being talked about finds its ultimate fulfillment in a spiritual sense, a result of what the Messiah is ultimately going to do for the world. Obviously then, Babylonians who repent are included among them too. Symbolically though, Babylon does become known as a representation of the enemy of God in the New Testament, especially in Revelation, but also in 1 Peter, where the author codenames Rome with Babylon. Having destroyed Jerusalem and a temple in 586 BC, the reason the New Testament uses this image is obvious. We can also see a purging taking place in the imagery that Isaiah uses. We see that the vineyard in chapter 1 and 5, which represents Judah, is purged by exile. A vineyard brings to mind something that is being cared for so that it produces cultivated grapes, not some wild fruit. God wants to take care of his vineyard, take care of his people, but expects to see some fruit. Unfortunately, the people have forgotten all about God, the source of their existence and protection. It breaks God's heart that he must judge the vineyard. We read that in chapter 5. But he is overjoyed when people make peace again with God. We read that in chapter 27, verses 2 to 5. This imagery of a vineyard is carried over into the New Testament with Jesus' parables of the vineyards, Mark chapter 12, verses 1 to 12, or when he compares himself with the vine in John chapter 15. We have this imagery of a woman in Isaiah, daughter Zion, daughter of Jerusalem, etc. The daughter in chapter 1 grows up and is ready to be married to God but becomes a whore in chapter 1 verse 21 to 23. As a result, God divorces from the woman in chapter 50 verses 1 and 2. Later she is allowed to return and she is restored. She again becomes God's wife and she is pregnant in chapter 54. The book begins and ends about Zion. It begins with God judging Zion. It ends with God bringing about a new Zion. Now Zion was originally the name of a Jebusite fortress that David captured in 2 Samuel 5 verse 7. It was also the name of the hill that fortress was built on. When Solomon built the temple on Mount Moriah, the name Zion expanded to also include the temple and its area. So when you read about Zion in Isaiah, you have to ask yourself which one Isaiah is referring to. Sometimes it's a mountain, but it can also refer to a temple area. Sometimes it's the city of Jerusalem, but it can also refer to the land of Judah, or to the whole nation, Israel. But then in Isaiah we keep reading all the way till the end, and suddenly we discover there is a whole new Zion, where Gentiles are included, and then it refers to God's kingdom, the church, the heavenly Jerusalem. The prophecies about the new Zion are fulfilled in the church according to the New Testament. Paul in Galatians 4 verses 21 through 31 says we as believers belong to the new Zion, the heavenly Jerusalem. The author to the Hebrews says we no longer belong to Mount Sinai, that is associated with fear and law, but we belong to Mount Zion, where we can find joy and Jesus, Hebrews 12:22. And then of course we have the book of Revelation, where Zion is described as both a place and a people, chapter 14 verse 1. The heavenly city of God, a place, and the bride of the Lamb, a people. All of this we also see in one book, and that is the book of Isaiah. Here we see first Zion coming under judgment, referring to the nation Israel, and changed into something new at the end of the book, which is the church. Looking at sections, we see 3 cycles, each ending with restoration. The first section pertains to the purging of Judah, followed with worship in chapter 12. The second section pertains to the purging of the nations,
reaching a climax in that the whole earth is judged and then restored, followed again with worship in chapter 25 and 22 to 27. In the third section, we are back at Judah being purged, and again a climax is reached. Not about Judah, but all the nations of the world are to be judged and restored. That too is then followed again with worship, and that is in chapter 34 and 35. In summary, when we come to the end of the first division, we have seen a cleansing of the people of God, whether it is talking about Judah or Israel, but the nations also are included. When we come to the end of the second division, we see God's ultimate purpose revealed in the form of a new heaven and earth. The book opened with quote-unquote Old Zion, which is physical, but ends with the New Zion, which is spiritual. For more information on Zion, see handout Zion in the Bible. This will be the end of this recording, and I would like you to finish charting chapter 1 to 5. Before you listen to lecture 2, I would like you to read 2 Chronicles 26 and 27, 2 Kings chapter 15, and Ezekiel 1. Then again read Isaiah chapter 6. For Isaiah 6 gives reference to each of the following parts: the vision, the problem, the solution, and the instructions. Chapter 6 also has a difficult passage that is used in all the Gospels and also in Acts. So it's important to study that too. Therefore, read again Isaiah 6 verses 9 to 10 and see how it is used in Acts 28 verses 23 to 28, and also how it is used in Matthew chapter 13 verses 10 to 15 and Mark chapter 4 verses 10 to 13. Now we will meet again when you are ready to listen to lecture number 2.